The rain had begun before the sun even set, slow and deliberate, as though the sky itself was thinking. It slid down the tall windows of the governor's mansion in careful lines, tracing the old wood and white columns until it disappeared into the earth. Inside, candlelight trembled in its glass, and a single pen scratched across paper like a slow confession. Governor Isaac Merrin sat at his desk beneath the portrait of his father, the founder of the Merrin dynasty, signing his name onto a decree that would outlive his breath. The Oconee River, he wrote, was safe, steady, and faithful. The ink was still wet when thunder rolled through the hills. His reflection shimmered faintly in the window, a man of power looking out over a horizon he thought he controlled. He was not cruel in the way that villains are drawn in books. His cruelty was quieter, made of pride and belief. Isaac Merrin believed in order, in the right of the powerful to speak for those who could, not read the documents they signed. He believed a governor could bargain with nature, the way he bargained with men. That night, when his aide brought him reports from the river towns, fields flooding, bridges weakening, he dismissed them with a polite smile. "The land bends to us," he said, pouring a glass of bourbon. "It's only a matter of time before the river learns who governs her." The aide left quietly, boots echoing through the hall like the pulse of fear itself. Outside, the rain deepened. Horses strained against their reins in the stables. The servants, most of them descended from freed families who still bore the memory of chains, whispered that the river was rising in anger. But the governor did not hear them. His study smelled of paper and tobacco, of oiled wood and pride. He wrote late into the night, ledger after ledger filled with numbers that promised prosperity, harvest yields, taxes, construction contracts for a dam meant to protect the people. Every figure was a small deceit, signed with the calm certainty of a man who thought his ink could hold back the rain. On the edge of town, mothers nailed boards to their doors while children watched the swollen sky. The telegraph wires hummed faintly, messages passing between counties that no one wanted to read aloud. But in the capital, everything was still. The mansion sat like a ship on the crest of a hill, candles glowing behind its windows, a beacon of false security. Inside, Isaac Merrin dipped his pen again, blotting the page where the ink had spread too far. It left a dark bloom that looked almost like water. He paused then. For a moment, the clock ticked. The thunder came again, closer this time, and the lamps flickered. Something, maybe conscience, maybe memory, crossed his face like a shadow. He thought of his father, who used to stand by that same window, warning him that the land never forgets who owns it. Isaac had built his career on that inheritance: control, confidence, and the quiet belief that nature was simply another subject to rule. So he signed the final page with a firm hand and closed the book. The decree was done. Tomorrow it would be printed in every paper from Augusta to Savannah. The governor had spoken. The river was faithful. He leaned back, exhaled, and listened to the patter on the glass. The rain did not sound faithful. It sounded like footsteps approaching through mud. Downstairs, a maid named Ruth was mopping the marble floor when she saw something peculiar, a trail of muddy footprints leading from the veranda to the front hall. She followed them, puzzled until they ended in nothing. No door had opened. No man had entered. She crossed herself quietly and whispered, "It's the river come to visit." When she told the butler, he laughed and told her to keep such talk to herself. The governor hated superstition, but Ruth could not shake the feeling that the house was listening. The next morning, the decree went out. Newspapers called it a testament of stability. Men in the capital raised glasses to the governor's wisdom, yet in the lowlands, the water crept closer to the roads. Farmers hammered planks across their barn doors. Letters were sent pleading for aid. Most went unanswered. Those that reached the mansion were filed away by clerks who never looked at them. Twice, Governor Merrin spent the afternoon dictating correspondence, his voice calm, deliberate. "Reassure them," he said. "Faith is worth more than fear." He believed it, or perhaps he only needed to. When the cameras came for the weekly photograph, he stood on his veranda beneath a clear umbrella, smiling faintly as the flash exploded. The image would appear in the Savannah Herald 2 days later. Captioned, "The Governor Faces the Storm." That evening, after the photographers left, he returned to his study. The sky had turned the color of wet slate. He poured another drink and stared at the map spread before. Him, the river twisting like a vein through George's heart. Every bend had been surveyed, every measurement recorded. Yet the line that mattered most, the one between arrogance and disaster, could not be drawn. He traced the ink with his finger and whispered, "You obey me." Outside, lightning stitched the horizon. The servants shuttered windows, whispering prayers they hadn't said since childhood. The air smelled of iron and magnolia. The rain came harder now, so heavy it blurred the world beyond the glass. Still, Isaac Merrin wrote, his pen carved through the sound of the storm as if defying it. Somewhere in the distance, a levee cracked, a quiet, muffled sound like a sigh. No one heard it over the wind. By midnight, the house felt like a ship again, tilting slightly as the ground softened. The governor's dog barked and refused to enter the study. The candles sputtered. He was alone with his ledgers, surrounded by the empire he had built on promises. He did not see that his reflection in the window, no longer moved in time with him. He did not see the candle flicker as though someone else had passed. Behind, he only wrote the words that would become his last. "The water obeys me." The ink dried unevenly. He stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling just slightly, though he did not know why. The bourbon glass tipped, the candle guttered. In that brief darkness, he thought he heard something. Not thunder this time, but a low voice beneath it, ancient and steady, whispering through the rain, "You forgot who fed you." He shook it off and returned to his desk, though his heart was no longer calm. Outside, the town clock struck 1. The flood was already moving through the valley, silent and immense. The first cottages vanished without a sound. Cattle broke loose. Fences floated away. A child's toy boat drifted down a dirt road that had become a stream. Miles away, the mansion still shone like a lantern. The river was coming home. When dawn arrived, grey and slow, the staff awoke to the sound of water against the back steps. Ruth ran to the door and saw the garden submerged. The roses were gone, replaced by a brown expanse that reflected the sky. She screamed for the others, but the governor's study remained locked. Inside, his desk was overturned. Papers scattered like feathers. The ledger lay open on the floor, pages smeared, the ink running down like tears. His pen was still there, caught between two warped boards, as though he'd dropped it mid-sentence. The governor himself was nowhere to be found. Some said he fled. Others swore they saw him on the veranda, standing calm as the water reached his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. The mansion's clock stopped at precisely 3:17 that morning. By the week's end, the river had receded, leaving behind silt, silence, and questions no one dared to ask aloud. The decree declaring the river safe was found floating among the debris near a bridge 5 miles downstream. It was warped and illegible, except for one line. "The water obeys me." That sentence became a warning whispered in every tavern from Athens to Macon. When the newspapers printed his obituary, they called him a man lost to natural misfortune. But those who had heard the river that night knew better. Nature does not forget the sound of arrogance. The flood had not come for the land. Only it had come for the man who tried to claim it. And somewhere beneath that same river, in the hush of silt and current, something still moves, slow, patient, and remembering. Some names only find peace once the truth is spoken. The year after the rains began, Georgia stood divided, half drowned in silence, half blinded by belief. The governor's mansion shone like a golden coin against a sky that hadn't been clear in months. Beneath its columns, Isaac Merrin's voice carried across the marble, smooth and deliberate, the sound of a man who had learned to make lies sound like leadership. He spoke of progress, of safety, of man's triumph over nature. His words filled newspapers, town meetings, even Sunday sermons, but the river didn't read, it only listened, and rivers have long memories. He had made his lie into law. The decree that promised the Oconee would never rise again became a foundation for every stone of the dam. It was more than a structure. It was a monument to pride. Engineers came and went, some skeptical, some scared. When one young inspector pointed out that the earth below the foundation was too soft, Merrin smiled and offered him a cigar. "Son," he said, "the ground respects confidence." The next week, the inspector's report disappeared. His replacement filed a glowing review. In the lowlands, where the soil turned to clay and the air hung heavy, families watched the dam rise like a wall between them and the truth. The governor's men called it progress. The farmers called it a warning. Wooden scaffolds groaned over the valley as stone met mud. The sound of hammers echoed through dawn and dusk, and with each strike, the land seemed to hold its breath a little longer. The river, once wide and open, now moved slower, resentful, cornered, forced to wait. By midsummer, the governor toured the site himself. He wore his best hat and gloves, his boots spotless against the churned mud. Reporters followed him, scribbling his words as gospel. "You see," he said, arms raised toward the horizon, "the river bends when man commands." The workers clapped because it was easier than questioning. But one of them, a man named Caleb, whispered to another, "The river don't bend, it breaks." His warning never left the camp. Money flowed like the river once. Had contracts were signed in cigar smoke and bourbon. Breath. Companies from Atlanta and Savannah sent their men to build, to measure, to profit. The governor's friends grew rich on the promise of control, and when the newspapers needed a story, they printed photographs of the dam, clean, mighty, uncracked, with captions that read, "Governor Merrin's masterpiece of modern engineering." The truth was simpler. The structure leaked, the reports were burned, and the silence that followed was worth more than any bribe. In the evenings, the townspeople gathered at the church. They prayed for steady ground, for mercy. The preacher, an old man with a tremor in his hands, opened his ledger one night and wrote a single line. "The Lord can part waters, but man should not." The ink bled slightly on the page. Like a wound refusing to close, he read it again and again, unsure if it was a sermon or a warning. The first crack appeared in August, a hairline fracture along the northern edge, where the earth had begun to settle unevenly. The engineers filled it with mortar and said, "Nothing." They feared the governor more than they feared the river. Reports were drafted but never sent. The clerk who kept copies of the blueprints woke one night to find his study on fire. By morning, there was nothing left but ash and the smell of oil. When he asked for an investigation, he was told the papers burned themselves. By autumn, the air changed. The humidity thickened until even the walls of the church began to sweat. The piano inside warped, its strings moaning when the choir tried to sing. The preacher stopped services one Sunday and told the congregation to listen. They thought he meant the storm outside, meant the silence underneath. "That's not thunder," he whispered. "That's the river remembering." Up at the mansion, the governor entertained guests from the capital. They drank champagne beneath chandeliers that once hung in his father's house. Bidowa. Air smelled of cigars and ambition. One senator asked, "If the dam could withstand another season of rain," Merrin smiled. "It's not rain I fear," he said. "It's ignorance, people. See cracks where there are none." His guests laughed politely, though one of them later told his wife he saw something in the governor's eyes that night. Not confidence, but defiance, the kind that tempts punishment. Meanwhile, the dam groaned. Locals swore they could hear it in their sleep, like a low voice beneath the earth. Children began waking in the night, coughing from the damp. Livestock drowned in flooded pastures, though the official reports called it seasonal saturation. A woman named Eliza wrote a letter to the governor, her handwriting neat but desperate. "My husband died building your dam," she wrote. "Now the water comes for my door. Is this the safety you promised?" The letter never reached him. His secretary filed it under unverified claims. By November, the rain returned, heavier than before. Roads washed out, mail routes closed, the paper mill shut down, the town's piano tuner left, saying there was nothing left to tune. Even laughter sounded warped now. Everything bent beneath the weight of moisture and memory. But the governor held his dinners still. He toasted to progress, to prosperity, to the illusion that control was still his to keep. He told stories of triumph to the sound of rain against stained glass, never realizing the rhythm outside had begun to mimic a heartbeat. When the papers asked for a new photograph, he posed again, same veranda, same half-smile, same umbrella. But the camera caught something different this time. In the reflection behind him, the horizon looked wrong. The dam stood in the distance, just visible, the waterline higher than it should have been. When the photograph was printed, that detail was cropped out. The preacher died that winter. They found him at his desk. The same ledger open before him. The final words written in shaky ink. "The Lord keeps his rivers. The rest is theft." The congregation read it aloud at his funeral, though no one dared say the governor's name. The bell tolled 7 times, once for each warning ignored. Up at the mansion, Isaac Merrin barely noticed the death. He was drafting another speech, this one for the legislature. It was to be about faith in leadership. The phrase "command of the elements" appeared 3 times. In the first paragraph, he didn't see the damp seeping into the edges of his papers, or the faint crack in the plaster above his desk. He was too busy preparing to prove he was right. Vivi. Dam held for now, but something in the air had changed. Birds no longer nested near the valley. Fishermen refused to cast their lines. Even the dogs howled. Differently at night, it was as if the world had grown weary of pretending not to know. One evening, his aide approached him with a telegram, brief, unsigned, delivered in secret. It read, "Water seeks the truth, you've buried both." Merrin tore it up and laughed. Yet later, alone, he couldn't shake the sound of tearing paper. It reminded him of something else, the way wood splits when the ground begins to move. By the end of the year, the town had changed its song. The laughter in the taverns had faded. The fiddles warped from damp air. Even the church bell rang dull. The people moved slower, speaking softer, as though afraid to disturb something sleeping beneath the ground. And through it all, the governor kept his smile. He dined beneath the soft hum of gaslight, surrounded by portraits of men who had never been questioned. When he raised his glass, the flame reflected in the crystal looked almost like water. They say arrogance echoes. It repeats itself across walls and generations, until someone finally listens. For months, the sound of his toasts echoed through the valley, soft, hollow, defiant, but underneath those echoes, the river murmured back. The water pressed against the dam with the patience of time itself, whispering in a language older than law. The governor's pride had built his monument. His silence had sealed it. The dam stood, wide and tall, holding back the truth for now. But deep in the soil beneath, the water shifted, restless and waiting, because the river was listening, and rivers do not forget. The flood did not begin with thunder. It began with a sound smaller than that, a low, trembling groan that came from deep within the dam, a sound that could have been mistaken for the turning of the earth itself. Those who were awake described it later as a sigh, as if the land had simply grown tired of holding a lie. It was still dark when the first crack gave way. The valley was asleep. Chickens rustled in their coops. Dogs whimpered, and in the governor's mansion miles away, a candle guttered out on his desk. Then came the break, a deep shattering sound that carried for miles, louder than any sermon or speech he had ever given. The river, long silenced, had finally spoken. The water moved with purpose. It came not as chaos, but as judgment, thick, heavy, unrelenting. It took barns first, their roofs lifting like pages turned by a cruel hand. Bridges folded, horses screamed. The current did not twist or rage. It simply advanced, swallowing everything that had once stood above it. Fields disappeared under its weight. In town, bells began to ring, not in warning but in prayer. By the time the church doors opened, the pews were already half submerged. In the capital, the streets filled with voices before they filled with water. Men shouted orders, carts overturned, and telegrams clattered through the wires, each one a little too late. The governor's name was on every tongue, but no one could reach him. The telegraph lines to his mansion had gone silent. They said the last message sent from his study read only, "It's holding." But by then, the dam had already surrendered. The militia arrived 3 days later. The roads were gone. They came by rowboat, gliding through the hushed remains of what had once been a proud city. The governor's mansion rose like a ghost above the waterline, its windows shattered, curtains floating like flags of surrender. The smell of silt and ink hung heavy in the air. Inside, the portraits were ruined, faces of ancestors bleeding into one another, the colors running down the gilded frames. In the great study, the desk had been overturned, papers scattered, soaked, and unreadable. A single candlestick still stood upright. Its wax melted into the shape of a tear. It was Ruth, the maid, who found him, or what the water had left of him. His body had drifted far from the house, caught against the iron gate of St. Elijah's church. The current had pressed him there gently, as though insisting he listen to the bells one last time. His hand was clenched around his leather ledger, the same book that had carried every lie he'd ever written about the river. They pried it loose with care. Inside, the ink had bled. But some words remained: falsified reports, forged signatures, numbers changed by trembling hands. At the very end, in writing uneven and desperate, there was a final line: "Forgive me, I buried the warning." The words spread through Georgia faster than the flood had. Reporters called it the Ledger of Lies. Townspeople read it in silence, the paper shaking in their hands. Some cursed his name. Others pitied him. But all agreed on one thing: the river had not come for revenge. It had come for remembrance. The people began to say that the Oconee had carried his confession itself, that it wanted the truth to reach the ocean. Every tributary whispered his story, every stream repeating the same message: no wall holds forever. The governor's funeral was small. The legislature ordered his body buried in an unmarked grave outside the Capitol. His portrait was taken down from the courthouse wall. The brass plaque beneath it was unscrewed and thrown into the river. It was said that on the night it sank, the water grew still for a moment, as if satisfied. Yet there were some who refused to erase him entirely. A few clerks, ashamed but loyal, kept copies of the ledger's final pages. They locked them in drawers and said nothing, afraid that even the truth might drown them too. Weeks passed. The flood receded. What remained was a strange stillness, as if sound itself had been washed away. Children picked coins from the mud where the market square had once been. Trees leaned in new directions, their roots exposed like scars. In the ruins of the church, the bell was found wedged against the altar, its tone cracked, its silence louder than any sermon. The survivors rebuilt in quiet. They spoke little of the dam, less of the man who had promised it would never fail. Yet in the evenings, when the air cooled and the river ran smooth again, they swore they could hear something beneath the current, a faint rhythm, almost like a pen scratching across paper. It was as if the water had learned to write. One night, a farmer named Caleb, the same man who had once warned the river would break, stood by the bank and looked at the reflection of the moon on the dark water. He said aloud, "To no one, you kept your word." He dropped a stone into the current, and the ripples moved outward in perfect silence. The Capitol never fully recovered. The governor's mansion was left to rot, its foundations cracked by the flood's retreat. Vines crawled up the pillars, swallowing the marble. The locals avoided it, calling it the house that drowned. Some swore they saw candlelight flicker in its upper windows on stormy nights. They said the governor still sat at his desk, signing decrees for a world that no longer existed. Decades later, when the new generation built another dam upriver, they found something buried in the silt, an old brass nameplate, polished smooth by years of current. The engraving was faint, but the letters could still be read. Governor Isaac Merrin, 1914. The foreman threw it aside and told no one. The workers continued, their machines humming over the same soil that had once swallowed a man-hole. History, as it always does, began to repeat itself, but some things cannot be fully buried. In the state archives, a young clerk once came across a damaged box labeled Merrin, confidential. Inside were fragments of the governor's ledger, pages fused together by water and time. When the clerk peeled them apart, the ink had formed new shapes: rivers, trees, faces. On one page, in the space where words had vanished, the stains made a pattern that looked uncannily like a gate. Beneath it, faint but visible, was the scrawl of a hand too hurried to care about neatness. "Forgive me." The clerk closed the box and returned it to the shelf. That night, she dreamed of water pressing against glass. Years passed into decades. The dam's remains became part of the landscape. Half buried under moss and reeds, travelers passed through without knowing what had happened there. The river seemed calm again, its surface smooth and obedient. But when storms came, the current deepened, darkened, and in its sound was a pulse, a slow reminder that truth, once drowned, never stops trying to rise. Old-timers in Georgia still tell the story. They say the governor's ghost doesn't walk. It drifts. They say his pen floats downstream every spring, its nib pointing toward the sea. They say if you stand by the water on a still morning and listen long enough, you can hear him whispering the line that ruined him. The water obeys me, and perhaps that is the cruelest part. For it was not wrath that drowned him. It was memory. Patient, heavy and exact, the kind of memory that outlasts monuments, the kind that seeps through stone and ink, until the truth finds its way to the surface, because the river never wanted revenge, it only wanted to be heard. Some names only find peace once the truth is spoken. The years that followed the flood were quiet, almost too quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The valley that once echoed with labor and laughter now hummed with the low voice of time healing what men had broken. The people rebuilt, not with marble or pride this time, but with timber and patience. Houses rose from the mud like forgiven prayers. The fields, once buried under the river's silt, bloomed again, heavy with corn and wildflowers, but beneath that calm surface, the memory of water still waited, deep and deliberate. Children played where the governor's mansion once stood, their laughter skipping over what had been stone foundations and broken glass. They didn't know the story in full, only the pieces their grandparents whispered when the rain began to fall. They knew that a man had lied, that a river had answered, and that some truths can drown a person faster than water ever could. On clear afternoons, they'd run along the riverbank, tracing the gentle curve of the Oconee where it bent toward the hills. The grown folk didn't mind the noise, but when spring came and the river swelled again, they called the children home early. No one wanted to hear what the old folks heard, the faint sound of boots pacing by the water, a rhythm that matched the beat of a guilty heart. Each April, the town gathered in silence. The new church, smaller and built on higher ground, held its annual service for the dead. The bell that had survived the flood, cracked but still strong, tolled 13 times, 12 for the lost, and 1 for the man who thought himself untouchable. No one spoke his name anymore, but the sound of that 13th toll carried through the valley like a whisper that refused to die. Old women crossed themselves. Men stood with hats in hand, their faces turned toward the ground. They didn't curse him, nor did they forgive him. They simply remembered. By the time decades had passed, the story of Governor Isaac Merrin had become something between history and haunting. Travelers heard it at taverns, from men too old to forget, but too tired to keep retelling. Some said the governor's ghost still wandered the flooded grounds, searching for his lost ledger. Others claimed to have seen the candlelight flicker in the ruins when the moon was high, or heard pages turning softly, though the house had been gone for years. Whether the stories were true didn't matter. The people believed them, because belief has a way of keeping truth alive. In the town's small archive, a woman named Clara worked as the keeper of what remained. She catalogued deeds, maps, birth records, all the brittle things time leaves behind. On quiet mornings, when the dust motes drifted like slow snowfall through the light, she sometimes thought she could smell the old flood in the air, earthy, metallic, faintly sweet. It was on one of those mornings that she found it. Between 2 ledgers marked 1914 and 1915, she noticed a slip of paper she'd never seen before. It was small, the edges browned like something rescued from fire. On it, in an unfamiliar hand, were 3 words, "Truth does not drown." Clara held it in her palm for a long while, feeling the uneven texture of the ink. She looked around the room as though expecting someone to explain, but the silence held. There were no signatures, no initials, nothing to tie it to a name. She placed it back where she found it, uncertain whether she had just discovered something or disturbed it. Later, when she told the minister, he smiled faintly and said, "Maybe the river wrote it." The valley began to change again in the years that followed. A railway line was built, cutting through the old floodplain. New families came, unaware of the history that slept beneath their feet. They planted gardens, built porches and told their own stories. Yet every so often, after heavy rains, the soil would shift and something old would rise to the surface. A piece of ironwork from the dam, a warped page of the governor's decree, a brick from the mansion, a child's toy boat, The townspeople treated these things gently, almost reverently. They didn't throw them away. They simply placed them near the church steps, where the rain could wash them clean again. No one talked about curses anymore. They talked about balance, about the way the earth has a memory, and how water is its voice. When the river ran high, people left offerings on the bank, candles, flowers, scraps of parchment with prayers written in pencil. The current carried them away slowly, as though reading each one before it disappeared downstream. The old preacher's replacement said it was superstition, but even he never crossed the bridge alone after dark. There were moments when the past reached through, quiet and uninvited. One spring, a traveling photographer came through town and took a panoramic image of the valley at dawn. When the plates were developed, he noticed a faint figure standing near the water's edge, a man in formal clothes, head bowed, one hand resting on a book. The figure wasn't visible to the eye that morning, and yet there it was, perfectly centered in the frame. The photographer showed the image to the archivist, and for a moment she thought she recognized the posture. But she said nothing, only turned the photograph over and wrote in small letters, "Unknown, 1914. The town grew smaller as the century turned. The younger generation left for the cities. The elders, those who still remembered the flood, passed on one by one, their stories fading into the rhythm of wind through grass. Yet even now, when the air grows thick and the river's surface trembles with rain, the people who remain say the same thing. Listen closely. Some swear they can hear it, the turning of pages, slow and deliberate, as though someone was still writing his confession beneath the current. Others say it's only the sound of the river, smoothing over stones. The way it always has. The truth, perhaps, is somewhere between the two. History does not vanish when we stop speaking of it. It settles deep, patient, waiting for the right hand to disturb the dust. The ledger, the decree, the flood, the name, these things still exist, not in the archives or in the soil, but in the silence people keep when the rains return. On the anniversary of the flood, Clara, the archivist long since grey and stooped, walked to the riverbank with a small candle and a page torn from an old ledger. The water shimmered beneath a pale moon. She lit the flame, whispered a line she could barely remember, and placed the paper on the surface. It drifted for a moment, then sank without a sound. The ripples spread outward until they disappeared. She waited there until the last light faded, then turned back toward the church. The bell did not ring that night, but she thought she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her, steady, deliberate, familiar. They say the river remembers. Maybe it does. Maybe the water carries more than silt and leaves. Maybe it carries everything we bury in it. Our lies, our apologies, our attempts to forget. And maybe that's why it never stops moving. It's not just a body of water, it's a witness, a keeper of stories too heavy for the living to hold. When the morning came, the valley looked new again. Mist rose from the river like breath. The sunlight touched the ruins of the old bridge, turning the wet stones gold for a brief, merciful moment. It was enough to make the place look holy, but underneath the current was still dark and deep, carrying the same soft murmur it always had. Some say that sound is just the river moving over rock. Others, the voice of conscience made liquid. Either way, it never stopped speaking. Not really, because time does not erase what it has learned, it only waits. And in that waiting, in that silence, history keeps its promise, quiet, patient, unbroken. Some names only find peace when the truth is told.